everybody. Thank you for staying with us in the workshop in regional science and input-output regional model. I would like to welcome to the discussion today Dr. Alejandro Díaz Bautista. He is research of economic department at the Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Welcome. Welcome to the Dr. Patricia Rivera. He is director of the economics department in our institution. Welcome, Patricia. Welcome to Dr. Noé Aarón Fuentes. He is our principal responsible for this event and these activities. And for contact to the Dr. Hewings. Dr. Hewings, welcome to Tijuana, to COLEF. We expect very much for these 2 days of activities. In a few moments, I read something about your excellent trajectory. Thank you for staying with us, Dr. Alejandro Monsiváis, Director of the Docencia, the Director of Docencia at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. In few minutes, I give you 2 minutes to welcome the institutional welcome to Dr. Hewings. And finally, welcome to the authorities from the Universidad Iberoamericana, campus Tijuana. Thank you for staying with us, and especially very thank you to all students for staying with us. Students from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, students from Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, and students from University Iberoamericana, Campus Tijuana. We are in COLEF very happy that you stay with us, and thank you for the researchers from the different departments at COLEF, especially from the Department of Economic. Thank you all for staying with us, and thank you, Alejandro, for come from Ciudad Juárez to Tijuana. Is for us this is very important. Many researchers from other sites from our institution stay with us here. Thank you for us. And now, Alejandro, please give you some words for the Dr. Hewings.
Good morning, everybody. It's very nice to meet you this morning. Our colleagues from UABC, from Ibero, our students and colleagues from El COLEF. I'm very glad to receive Professor Hewings. As the saying goes, welcome to Tijuana. You will find much more than what the song describes.
Yeah.
If you search, you may find that also. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Noé Aarón Fuentes, who had the initiative to invite Professor Hewings. I very much appreciate this initiative, and on behalf of our postgraduate studies at El COLEF, I believe this is a very important step to the internationalization of our programs. As you will testify, Professor Hewings is one of the most brilliant economists in the United States, so we are pleased and honored to have him with us this morning. I'm very sure this panel, this workshop will be extremely productive and encouraging for our students. Welcome, Professor Hewings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. Now we start our workshop with the conference Demographic Challenges to Regional Development. But first, I want to read some aspects about the Dr. Hewings because it's very important. Everybody know many aspects along the big trajectory of the Dr. Hewings. He is director of the Regional Economics Applications Laboratory, REAL, in the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Hewings is responsible for the overall direction of REAL in collaboration with funding agencies and clients and supervision of graduate students who work for real on the Urbana campus of the University of Illinois. Dr. Hewings, obtaining his bachelor from the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom, and the master and PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. Prior to coming to Illinois in 1974, he was on the faculty of the University of Kent at Canterbury, United Kingdom, at the University of Toronto in Canada. In addition to his position in Real, he is a professor of geography and regional science of economics and of urban and regional planning. He has served as a visiting professor at the University of Queensland, Australia, Bahrain University in Israel, Tianjin University in China, University of Indonesia, and Kagawa University in Japan. He has received Fulbright and Woodrow Wilson Awards, and in 1995, the Regional Science Association International recognized him with an award for service to regional science, as well as naming the Geoffrey J. Hewings Junior Scholars Award. Annually awarded to exceptional scholar less than 10 years from completion of his or her PhD. In 1996, he was made a university scholar by the University of Illinois. In 1998, a paper with Eduardo Haddad was named the best paper award at the second Encuentro Regional de Economía por el Banco do Nordeste en Fortaleza, Brazil. He received in 2003 John Dickinson Memorial Award, the best paper award too, for a paper writing with Miguel Marquez and Julián Ramajo in the Australasian Journal for Regional Studies. In 1903, he received the Walter Isar Award for distinguished scholarship achievements in the field of regional science, and the same year was made a Fellow of Regional Science Association International. Who knows Walter Isar? Understand the big personality who is today with us. Also in 1903, he was awarded Doctor Honoris Causa by the University of Bourgogne, France. En la Asociación Brasileira de Estudios Regionales honored him an award of service to regional science in 2004. His major research interests lie in the field of urban and regional economic analysis, with a focus on the design, implementation and application of regional models. He has devoted considerable time to the way in which these models might become useful in policy information and evaluation. In addition to the continuing development of regional econometric output models for a number of U.S. states and metropolitan areas, Hewings is working on several modeling projects in Brazil, Colombia, Japan, Korea, and Indonesia, and we expect Mexico too. Recent work in the Middle West, Brazil, and Korea has focused on linking regional macromodels with transportation network models to explore impacts of unexpected events like earthquakes, expansion of transportation infrastructure, and the impacts of port efficiency. At the metropolitan scale, attention has been directed to the estimation of intrametropolitan flows of goods, people, income, and consumption expenditures with the Chicago region to measure the changing degree of interdependence. Theoretical work remains directed to issues of economic structure and structural change interpreted through input-output, social accounting, and general equilibrium models. The issues of, again, immigration and general demographic challenges to development have been explored in a serious discussion of papers. For us, I insist, it's an honor that Dr. Hewings stay with us. Please, this is now your time for the conference. You have 15 minutes or 1 hour maximum, and then the discussion for the Dr. Alejandro Diaz. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Araceli, thank you very much for your most generous remarks, and as he goes out, Dr. Alejandro, for your nice welcome. Distinguished colleagues, it is my pleasure to be here, and it's also a source of embarrassment. And I mention that because I have been living in Illinois for 40 years. And I have had in my lab, which is now celebrating 25 years of existence, a grand total of 2 students from Mexico. One this year, and one who's now in Aguas Calientes 3 years ago. I want that to change. And part of the reason for my being here is I'm on a mission. And my mission is to try to recruit as many of you as possible. Unfortunately, not all of you, because I don't have room, to consider coming to spend some time in Illinois. Because I think that as we look to the future of economies such as Mexico, probably the most critical investment that the Mexican government can make is in human capital, and in particular, in your human capital. And so part of that process, I think, is giving you some international exposure. And the ability, I think, to operate outside your own neighborhood, outside your own country, is part of the internationalization process that many of you are going to be challenged by as you look to the future 10, 15, or 20 years from now. So we have had very good conversation with your president this morning, and we hope that over the next several years, more and more of you will be enjoying the beautiful environment of Illinois. Why is it beautiful? Because it is not physically beautiful, all right? So forget about the visage that you look out there. We don't have dolphins and whales. We don't have a sea. We don't have mountains. We have no externalities except intellectual externalities. We have a library with 10 million books. We have 44,000 students on our campus. We have world-class professors. The university was ranked 29th overall in the world. All right? We're not a second-class university. We're a place that you can really come and enjoy a wonderful intellectual experience. And we're not alone. We are hoping that through our network we can expand opportunities for some of you to go spend some time at other American universities. And I think if we can do that over the next 10 or 15 years, I think we will significantly help the Mexican economy address some of the issues and challenges it's going to be facing. And so my dream, my goal over the next 10 years is to see more and more of you in my lab. And if I'm successful at that, I will be a very, very happy person. Right. So, thank you for your very warm welcome. I know for many of you, listening to a gringo speaking in English is going to be very stressful. But I will try to speak slowly, which is very difficult for me, because originally I'm from Wales, Gales, and Welshmen are known for their ability to talk very fast and to sing very rapidly too. But I promise you I will not sing, only in my head, in my spirit. Okay. What I'd like to do is 2 things. One, I want to tell you a little bit about a story of research that we're doing, which about 2/3 of the way through you will see the connection to Mexico. All right? And it's part of a story that is one of the biggest challenges that I think countries like the US are going to be facing over the next several decades. It's the problem of aging. And it's something that a lot of economists have not really looked at and explored. But I hope by the end of my presentation I will have convinced you that it is important. And secondly, before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about my lab. And I think that's important. So as I said, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. And what we've tried to do is something that a lot of economists and economics departments have stopped doing. And that is to become involved in policy debate. We don't form policy. We try to, as we say, inform it. By that I mean we provide analytical interpretation of events. We look at alternative impacts of policy number 1, policy number 2, policy number 3. We provide regional, not national, regional macroeconomic forecasts so that our decision makers can get a sense of some of the challenges they're going to be facing. And one of the great delights in our lab is that we move from theory to model development, but then the real benefit comes in terms of the policy application. And it's really very, very wonderful for my students to be doing work that is going to appear in an academic journal, and at the same time they can share with me the opportunity to go talk to policymakers and try to interpret it. And what they have to learn is a different language. When you talk to an assembly like this, you can talk as an academic. When you talk to businessmen, you cannot do that. All right? You have to talk in a very, very different language. So you see on this slide, I say I teach my students to be schizophrenic. Now psychologists say, no, we're trying to solve schizophrenia. We don't want you to increase the number of people who are schizophrenic. I'm saying intellectually schizophrenic. And I remember I talked to a group of businessmen, and one of my students was there, and afterwards came, if I had not seen you there, I would not have believed that coming out of your mouth was the language you were using. You didn't mention the word model. You didn't mention the word externalities. You didn't mention estimation techniques. Nothing. It was all discussion. You were telling stories, illustrating what we had done. And that's, I think, something that people like Paul Krugman, that many of you may read, is a brilliant expositor of translating economics into a language that the common person can understand. And that's what I try to help my students do. One thing that makes us very different is that we're organized like a science lab. Nobody has a private office, including me. Everybody is in one big room, divided. You have to interact with your neighbors, but only in English. If you want to speak Spanish, it's like the old days with cigarettes. You have to go outside, all right? So we are Spanish-free zone, Korean-free zone, Japan-free zone, and even Welsh-free zone. But I would be the only person speaking Welsh to myself. So I think the advantage of that, when my wife went back to the university to do her PhD in plant pathology, I looked at her environment where the students were doing experiments together, they were talking. It doesn't happen enough in social science. We tend to go into our office, we close the door, we don't talk to each other. You come to my lab, you cannot escape. You have to talk. You have to get involved in everybody's research. And I think that's really stimulated the generation of new ideas. And furthermore, by getting involved in somebody else's research, you come involved with them for a lifetime. And you become involved in their research, you meet them at meetings. So that's important. And in addition, we have an organization in Europe. It's a virtual lab, and last year we celebrated our 10th meeting. All the alumni who have spent time with me in Illinois get together once a year in Europe. We give papers, we have nice social times, we catch up, but it's very professional. And so that's nice. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. What I've listed here, and I'll leave this presentation with you if you're interested, you can see some of the work we do. Most importantly, I want to point out that our participants come from 13 different countries. Right? And the only participant that is missing is an American. Right? And I'm the only American there, but I was born in Wales. So I'm a Welsh American. All right? So we have no Native Americans. So if you come spend time, you're not going to think, oh my God, I'm going to be the only international person there. No, you'll be one of 15 Spanish-speaking people, and people will make fun of your accent. Because those from Guatemala think people from Mexico speak very bad Spanish. And the people from Spain think everybody speaks bad Spanish, except people from Spain. All right. So over the period of our 25 years, over 40 doctoral dissertations have been supported by research in Rio. So we're very, very proud of those. And the final thing that we want to start with Mexico is the last point. We have this Bolsa Sandwich program with Brazil, where students come and spend 1 year with us in the middle of their PhD program, By the end of this year, we will have had 20 students who've come from Brazil. All of them have gone back. All of them have jobs. And it's a very, very nice aspect of our program. I'd love to have such a program with El Colegio and the participating universities here. So we can begin to build a network of interactions, which I think will be important. So what am I going to talk about today? Demographic changes. And I think one of the most important parts of this is that if you look through the economics literature, you'll see a lot of work on rural-urban migration. You'll see a lot of work on the demographic transition. But the type of interactions that I'm going to talk about between demography and the economy have received relatively little presentation. So I'm going to reflect on some of the work, and on the first slide you saw some of my younger mafia who have worked with me on this, and I really appreciate all their contributions, and many of them are now co-authors on the publications that have come out with this. Our work is going to highlight modeling that involves something called computable general equilibrium models. And these are models that try to mimic the circular flow of income in an economy and try to capture both demand side and supply side. And inside this model is an input-output system, which is capturing the interdependencies between activities. And so it's a very, very rich modeling form. And on top of this, we put something that you'll see a little later. It's called an overlapping generations model. So that instead of talking about demography at one point in time, we're looking at how that demographic structure changes. And this is, I think, very, very important for reasons that will become obvious. What I've listed here is some of the other models that we look at. We have several types of econometric input-output modeling that we do impact analysis. We do forecasting for this. We do a whole bunch of other activities. We have an index of leading indicators for the Chicago metropolitan region and other metropolitan regions. And most importantly, we look at the housing market. And in particular, we try to make forecasts of sales and prices 3 months ahead, and once a year, 12 months ahead. And this then provides us with a lot of visibility in the local newspapers, because every month people will look at our report and then they will ask questions and so forth. And that's been very good, because we've generated a number of doctoral dissertations. We now have developed a new index for housing prices, and we're also looking at the effects of foreclosure, which are houses that are stressed and the people cannot pay the mortgage, and it becomes owned by the bank or the financial institution, and it has a very depressing impact on prices. And so this student has been looking at the geography of this impact. How far away does a distressed house decrease the prices of other houses? And so we use a lot of spatial econometrics. Where's our colleague who teaches there? So I got a plug for your field as to why spatial econometrics is important for us to look at. All right, so that's what keeps us active. And we're also looking at strengthening our research in migration, and you'll see why as I come to it. So my presentation, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the role of aging. Then I'm going to look at the role of migration and how we model this, and some potential sense of what its impact will be. Now, I'm a regional economist, so I don't focus at the national level, I focus at the regional level. And the region that I'm going to deal with for the most part is the Chicago metropolitan region. And so don't worry about, well, I don't know anything about Chicago, just that it's a fabulous city and you should come to visit. It's probably the most American of American cities. And it's a wonderful, diverse place. And 25% of the city's population is now Latino. And by 2030, 37% of the metropolitan area will be Latino. So you will not feel isolated. However, I will say that Chicago tacos do not compare with the tacos I get. I mean, they are Americanized in bad ways. But there are other aspects that are very, very attractive. So this is what I'm going to focus on in my discussion. I will put a few equations up, but I'm not going to spend any time at them. But I just want to reveal to you that this is not based on a spreadsheet. This is based on an analytical model that took a lot of time to calibrate, to estimate, and finally to make forecasts. So what we look at is trying to capture in a more extensive way this triangular interaction that takes place in an economy. So typically in an economy, we're interested in how changes in the structure of production affect changes in the structure of income. So if you move from manufacturing to more services, that's going to change the income that you generate. If you change the income, you're going to change what people spend the money on. What they spend the money on will then effectively change the structure. So you have this circular interaction that we have found common in many models. And what we've done in our lab is looked at a couple of things which are of interest. One of which is how interregional trade has changed. Not trade between US and Mexico, but trade between states within the US. And one of our dreams is to try to do something similar in Mexico and in Canada, and then link the whole thing together. So we could see Mexico, a state trade to a state in the US, and try to capture the impact. And the reason for this is where I think the heterogeneity is going to come in economies. And the World Bank, OECD, the Inter-American Development Bank have all come to the conclusion that they need to get below the national level. There is so much diversity within countries that looking at national level trade is not good enough anymore. So that's what we're looking at. And the other part is that we're expanding this by looking at the demographic stuff, particularly in and out migration, aging, and some variation in regional preferences. Why is that important? Well, mainly for a couple of reasons. My metropolitan area, Chicago, is one of the second or third largest recipients of international migration. All right? As we will see, a lot of that coming from Central and South America. So that's energy coming into the region, particularly younger people. At the other end, we're the second largest loser of people who retire and then migrate out. Okay. Good example would be my wife. She is from Boston, which is in the northeast of the US. They have very severe winters. Then she revealed to me 3 years ago she was done with winter, right? So she spends the time in Arizona. She's salivating to come here to spend time in Baja California. She is essentially a biologist. And doing this in the winter would be perfect, right? So she is typical of what happens to people in the Midwest. When they get to be 65 or 66, they say, enough. They move to Arizona or to Florida. Except one of my neighbors moved back. And I said, why did you move back? And this was on a February day where the snow was coming horizontally. It was minus 20 centigrade. The wind was blowing, 50 kilometers an hour. Horrible. I said, don't you miss Florida? No. Why did you come back? He said, my wife and I decided we couldn't live there anymore. I said, why not? There are too many old people. And I said, that's interesting. He said, we go out to eat dinner. And what did they discuss? Hey, Noe, did you hear Araceli's having a new operation? Okay, her mother is dying, her brother is on some disability. It was all about death and dying. My wife refers to Florida as death's waiting room. People are sitting around waiting to die. He said, so I came back to Illinois. He said, it's amazing. 2 weeks later, they arrested the governor for corruption. So we had 2 governors in jail. We were number 1 in corruption in the whole country until New Jersey arrested 26 politicians. And we went back to number 2. But it's an interesting phenomenon that this migration and aging stuff is very, very complicated for reasons that will become clear. So as we look at the data, we'll see that a number of things are happening. We'll see that the percentage is increasing of people over 65. But the most important question is, what impact do they have on an economy? Do people who are 70 years old spend money the same way you young people spend money? All right? And that's an interesting question. Because going back to that triangle, as our economy ages, if consumers spend money differently, it's going to have a different impact on the structure. And so that's what we are looking at. Okay. So here are the data. And this is a common phenomenon, including China. The Chinese population by 2030, there will be 180 million people in China over 65. Can you imagine that? It's unbelievable. And now the Chinese government has relaxed its one-child policy. Why? Because even though they have over 1 billion people, they are threatened with a labor shortage in the next 20 or 30 years. And so what we're seeing here is not unusual. Notice by 2030, around 20% of the US population, France, Italy, Germany, Canada, Japan, Korea, etc., are all going to face this problem. 20% of the population will be over 65. So this is not a small change. This is a dramatic change in the structure. And the most important implication, these are population cohorts. So here is the age groups from 85 above and 0 to 4 at the bottom. And this is the share of female, and this is the share of males. And this is for 2000, and this is for 2030 for the state of Illinois. The most important thing to notice are two things here. The prime working age group, 25 to 44, is going to decline by 8%. 1/3 of a million less people working. All right? More importantly, those over 65 will grow by almost 1 million. Okay. So we're having a very dramatic structural change in the demography, whereas most economists have been looking at structural change in the economy, looking at how industry structure has changed, forgetting and ignoring one of the most dramatic changes that's taking place. That's in the demography. And it's the intersection between this sort of change and the changes in the economy that is the focus of much of our research. I'm going to jump over some of these things. What we try to do is look at the consumption impacts of this. Because one of the questions are, does it really make any difference if you have a population with 15% over 65 or 30% over 65? What happens when you have this decrease in the population that are between 25 and 45? What does it have in terms of its impact on the economy? And to do that, we employ something called AIDS, which is unfortunately named before the horrible disease. It's called an almost ideal demand system. And what this does is essentially tries to estimate how people's consumption is a function of the price of the good plus the relative prices of all other goods. And so it estimates this in a very interesting fashion and enables us to capture the impacts of changes in prices. And then from this, we can see how people reallocate their shares of their income to different quantities of goods and services. And what we have done in our model is we have 6 ages of reference persons. So we have people 20 to 25, 25 to 35, and so on and so forth. And we also have 5 quintiles of income. The bottom 20%, the next 20%, and the top 20%. And the reason for this is that we're very interested in what the impacts of aging might have on income distribution. And this is another phenomenon that we're very concerned about, because right now, income inequality in the US is worse than at any time since the Depression in the 1930s. And people like Stiglitz and Piketty, a French economist, are claiming that increased inequality is detrimental to the economic growth and development of an economy. So this is one of the reasons why we want to look at it. All right. And then from these data, we're able to get both price elasticities and expenditure elasticities. So I'm not going to dwell on how we do this and blah, 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 because we employ a lot of social accounting matrices where we get not only income from wage and salary, but also income from non-wage and salary, from dividends, from ownership of houses, ownership of businesses, and so on and so forth. And for some people, this can be a very important concern. And so what I provided here is a summary of some of the findings. But the most important aspect of all of this comes in this little graph here. If we just had one representative household in our model, this would be the forecast of consumption growth from 2003 to 2030. But when we divide them up by these age categories, we see we have enormous heterogeneity. Not surprisingly, the younger household groups are actually going to decline, and this is in terms of the volume of consumption. So there are two effects here. One is people at different ages spend money differently, and the number of people in those age groups is changing. So put those two things together, you get this enormous spread in terms of the effects of people at different age in terms of the volume of consumption on the economy. So the next question to ask is, do people in this age group, 45 to 54, those 55 to 64, and those above 65, do they spend their money differently? What is the impact on the economic structure of the Chicago economy? And here is just some examples to illustrate. Here are the age categories on the bottom. Here is the share of money that's spent on food. And you can see that over time, there's going to be increasing divergence. Here is money on beverages and tobacco going down, mainly as a result of decreases in expenditures on tobacco. Housing increases. When you're in your 20s and 30s, you have children, you require a larger house, and then finally they leave home, and you can afford, you can afford then to buy a slightly smaller house, and so the share of your expenditure on housing decreases. Healthcare goes up, the share of your income. Transportation is relatively constant and starts to decline. As your eyesight deteriorates, you cannot drive a car anymore. You have to take taxis and buses and so on and so forth. So what we're suggesting here is a reasonable degree of heterogeneity in terms of expenditures. And just to highlight a few things, this is something that we were very excited about to see that over time, from 2003 to 2030, the share of expenditure on food was declining. And as you know, we have some problems with the health aspects of food consumption in the U.S. And I thought, this was very exciting. Perhaps this is good from a health perspective. However, this is food purchased in a grocery store that you take home and you prepare. That's not good news. And in the category down here is included purchases in restaurants. And you can see it's going from 12% to 25%. Not good news. And not surprisingly, the healthcare costs as a percentage are going up slightly for people over 65, but the biggest impact is going to be people in the 35 to 64 age group. Their share of their income that would be allocated to healthcare will go up. So when we put this all together in terms of the modeling and the impacts on the economy, we have statistically significant differences in forecasts when we have just one household as opposed to when we disaggregate those households. And now we've reworked this and in a much more sophisticated way, and we are finding that it's even more statistically significant than it was in the earlier experiments. And that is very sort of comforting news and really justifies the work on this. But what we want to look at then is, we've got these changes as a result of demographic structure. What is the impact of the aging process? And how does this have an impact on the economy? And for that, we developed a slightly different model, in this case, a computable general equilibrium model with this overlapping generations component that I mentioned earlier. And what we're trying to look at is how changes in fertility, in other words, how many kids you have, and mortality, how long you expect to live, what impact that has. What are the impacts of the age distribution on the growth of the economy, and what effect, most importantly, will the potential shrinking, the decrease in the number of people in the labor force have on the regional economy? So we've noticed from the earlier work that we have, as people age, differences in tastes. I don't tend to buy the roller blades anymore. It's a little dangerous for somebody at my age. I spend much more money on things that I never spent when I was much younger. We also have differences due to income levels. You remember from your economics, things called Engel curves. We actually use them. Yeah, it's amazing. You know, something you learn in a classroom in economics can actually be valuable. All right? There are regional differences. People in Florida don't buy winter coats, although people in Los Angeles have a higher consumption of fur coats than people in Chicago, because they want to show everybody how rich they are. Right? You know, and it's 15 degrees in LA and they're wearing a fur coat. You know, all right? And then there are differences by age. All right. So one of the things that we're thinking of is there are demographic cycles that we need to think about, and they've been mainly neglected in the literature. But the most important thing on this slide is all the baby boomers, those that were born after the Second World War from 1945 to the early 1950s, they're going to be retired. They've already started to retire. All right, 77 million of them. All right. What's going to happen to them? Where are they going to live? What sort of economic impact are they going to have on the economy? The other aspect of this that's important is changes in something we call the old age dependency ratio. We are looking at very significant changes in the percentage of people who are in the labor force as opposed to the percentage of people not in the labor force. And that dependency ratio, you can see, is going to climb from 19% to 33% over the next 50 years. And that's generating enormous concerns about how we can operate as an economy absent migration. And so you can begin to see why migration is something a very, very great concern to us. Let me skip this one and talk about it. All right. So what we're looking at in our state is the process of churning that takes place. We lose about 12,000 retirees every year who reach 65 or whenever it is they decide to retire, and they move out of state. Okay? At the same time, we've got about 40 to 50,000 immigrants coming in from various parts of the world. So you can see that over a period of 10 years, we can have some significant structural changes taking place in that demography. And just to give you a flavor of this, the out-migration minus the in-migration in people terms is one dimension, but we also have information about the income of people coming in and the income of people leaving. As a result, in the 10 years from 2000 to 2010, the Chicago region lost about $1 billion a year in income. Is that important or not important? If that money had been spent, it would have generated about 20,000 jobs. In a good year, we create 44,000 jobs. So net out migration is robbing the Chicago region of about 50% of a job increase in a good year. So it's not a trivial issue. Again, it's a demographic change that has been generally ignored in the literature. All right. So we have this CGE model we link it with the overlapping generation of the model. And you say, why all this attention to this demographic stuff and consumption? Look at the last line here. Consumption is 70% of gross product on the expenditure side. We have one representative household. We have 435 sectors in our model. But in the household, we had one. So it's very important for us to disaggregate that and try to understand the dimensions of this over time. So one of the things that we looked at is linking this with a model called an overlapping generations model. And just give you a stylized representation of this. If you think about the age, year 0, year 1, and year 2, you have generations that have yet to be born, all right, that eventually will appear, and they will be aging. Then you have generations that occurred a year earlier that are beginning to age. So you have all this process, and if you aggregate at any particular time period, you've got a combination in your population of people who are 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, all the way up to 85 or larger. Now, we can't handle that sort of density. So what we tend to do is aggregate this into 5-year age cohorts, because it's much more tractable in terms of model. But this is the whole idea of the overlapping generations, so that the population is heterogeneous with respect to age. And that age, we know, has different consumption. All right. So in our model, we have a 2-region system: Chicago, the rest of the US, just to make it simpler for us. We have age-specific mortality, and we have borrowing constraints, all right? And basically, we have to make some assumption about how people behave in this model. And we adopt something it's called intertemporal utility maximization. Now, here's the issue, all right? I get paid this year, at least I hope so. And I have to make 2 sets of choices. How much do I put in my retirement fund in anticipation when I stop working that I'll have some money, right? Part of that will be Social Security. Part of that will be my own private pension investment in stocks and bonds, all right? So I set that aside. The second part is I have the remainder, and after I pay the government, I have my disposable income. What do I spend that on in terms of goods and services? In our model, we have 2 choices. We buy goods produced in Chicago or goods produced in the rest of the US. And what I do as an individual is I assume that I maximize my expenditure allocations over time in anticipation of expected income and how long I expect to live, which is forever. No. In this case, 85. Which is my intermediate step, but I've subsequently upped it, and in later versions of the model, it will go to 95, which is my new target. Why? Because we have to have a cutoff point. And we assume in the model that there is a non-zero probability that you will die at any time. Well, what happens to your assets? In this model, it's a socialist state, because we assume that the assets are equally distributed to the remaining population. Obviously, that needs to be modified because that's not how things happen in the real world. But it makes the model tractable. All right. So that's what we do. I've described this in terms of the first step and the second step, and why the intertemporal aspect is very important. We assume populations live to 85. We assume that the individual enters the labor force at 21 and retires without option at 65. And again, we can change that if we want to. We ignore children, all right, in this model for reasons of tractability. Okay. Each individual is assumed to face borrowing constraints. The Social Security is not an option. We have to make those payments, and we make endogenous decisions about the optimum rate of Social Security in the model. Okay. Now, one limitation is we assume everybody in an age cohort has identical preferences. Right? In later models, we have allowed some heterogeneity of people, say, age 55. All right? They certainly have heterogeneity in terms of their income, but not at the moment in terms of their preferences. All right. And secondly, we assume that wages differ across the two regions, Chicago and the rest of the U.S. All right. Okay. We assume then that agents are forward-looking and only wish that more of them were, and this is what the mathematics looks like. And what we effectively get is sort of elasticities, which are elasticities of substitution from goods now, and then an intertemporal elasticity. What is the benefit of my saving in anticipation of consuming later? Right. Okay. So this is what we end up with. And I don't like this. Why don't I like this? Because it assumes that one's productivity and therefore one's income declines after the age of 50. And in terms of looking at the University of Illinois, the most productive faculty are here. Okay? That's a biased assessment, but I think I have a lot of empirical points. So we're going to have to modify this. And what we assume is that your wage income increases to a maximum around your 50s, and then it begins to decline, and then when you retire, it goes to zero. And what's the rest of your income? This is your capital income from your savings account, from your investment in stocks and bonds and so forth. And what you assume is that after you retire, you basically convert that capital into some sort of annuity that you then spend down until at age 85, which in our model is when you leave. This is the income that comes from your endowment, and this is your pension income. All right. I showed this to my kids, and I said, I want you to see this, because you see that there? Zero when I go. So don't sit around licking your lips and thinking, when mom and dad go, wow, are we going to be wealthy? You won't, because I'm a rational economist, and I can't take it with me. So the only option you have is to try to, is to make applications to the Fundación Hewings for some sort of benefit now. Okay, so the final part of my analysis, and I will take no more than 10 minutes to do this so we have time for some discussion, is the role of migration in this whole process. So we've now got this model calibrated. We know what the impacts of aging are likely to be. Now we want to address the question, what about the effects of migration? And you cannot live in Mexico and not be unaware of the enormous debates that are taking place in the U.S. right now of the role of immigration. And I have to say, I'm just horrified at how uninformed those debates are. People are voting emotionally. When I try to give presentations to them, they don't even pay attention because they don't want to know. They know themselves. This is particularly our politicians. And it's very, very sad because we are, I think, as a country, missing a huge opportunity to be very, very proactive in this regard. And it's unfortunate, but I'm not a politician. So this is the sort of dialogue that we hear. In the red are the remarks that people who are against immigration make. Oh, if you let all those Mexicans come in, they will take jobs away from Americans. I don't think so. I think, to the contrary, thank God Mexicans have come in. The state of Arizona would not function without Mexicans. I mean, I spend enough time there to observe that I think 90% of the construction and maintenance that goes on in that state is conducted by Mexican immigrants. So goodness knows what would happen if that was not the case. So the crowding out is a sort of an emotional response, and it's the empirical evidence. If you look at Europe, the same thing is true there, that it's not a crowding out. The London transport system would come to a halt were it not for the immigrants who are driving the buses and operating the underground. The other part of this is They will reduce wages because you increase the supply. It's a classic economics 101. Increase the supply of labor, wages will move downwards, all right, because you have greater supply, all right? And with demand relatively constant, that's not going to change. And this will be particularly true for those at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of low skills. Finally, there is a possibility that you will generate higher income disparities, all right? Because most of the impact of immigration is at the lower end of the spectrum. So you're depressing low income wages without having much impact on middle and high income, so that the disparities will increase. So that's the negative. On the positive side, immigration may change the age structure and the imbalance caused by aging population. In other words, it may help reduce the shrinking or the decline in the workforce age population. And the other part that, again, no debate in Congress about this, if you have more immigrants working and paying taxes, they're going to help contribute to the solvency of the Social Security system, because it's going to be 30, 40 years before those immigrants retire. They're going to be paying taxes, Social Security contributions. So they have a very strong benefit on the fiscal stability of the pension program. All right? So those are the sort of discussions that we hear a great deal of. So Illinois has about 4 million legal immigrants, about 40,000 per year, mainly concentrated in Chicago. And of those immigrants, about 1/4 are Mexicans, and in some years it's been as high as 50%. It fluctuates rather substantially. A lot of immigrants come from Mexico, but they are not Mexicans. They're people from Guatemala, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, or Colombia who come into Mexico and then come into the U.S. All right. But the other thing that's very interesting is that there are still huge differentials between the birth rates of the Latino immigrant population and the native population in the first generation. By the second generation, they are statistically not significant. So one of the things that we're finding is that as a result of natural increases, the Latino population is increasing much, much more rapidly than the non-Latino population. All right. So we calibrated this model for 2005 using a social accounting model for the Chicago region and the rest of the U.S. And we focused on the population 25 to 85. And so one of the things that we want to look at is what effect will we have on macro indicators if we have zero immigration, if we have the current level of immigration, in other words, 40,000 a year. Let's suppose we increase it slightly to 60,000, then to 80,000, and so on and so forth. Now, Chicago cannot issue visas. That's the U.S. government. So how do we attract more immigrants? By becoming immigrant friendly, all right? By having our mayor come down to Mexico and say, please come to Chicago. We welcome you, all right? And bring your mother with you so she can cook tacos. Okay. And so what we were trying to get a sense of is how these three scenarios where we have increasing immigration would affect our population. First thing is that with the highest level of immigration, the dependency ratio by 2030 would return to the level we observed in 2005. In other words, the immigrants will be swelling the ranks of those employed and therefore expanding the labor force, so the dependency ratio would decline. Now we assumed, as you can see, that immigrants were equally distributed in the ages 21 to 35, and we assumed that because the empirical evidence suggests that they are relatively low skilled compared to the existing population, we assumed that their productivity was about 60% of the peak at 47 years of age. And so let's look at some of the results. Okay, this is the impact on gross product And initially we're going to look at the effect on the capital labor ratio. And what happens is, if you don't have aging, the decline is very, very rapid. With immigration, the decline is less rapid, and eventually around 2040 stabilizes and starts to turn up. All right. Now, that is sort of interesting, but not very compelling. When we look at gross regional product, we find a much more profound effect. If we look at just the effect of aging, our gross regional product by 2050 will be 9% lower than it is right now. That's a huge decline, right? That's assuming no immigration, right? But if we increase the immigration, look what happens to our gross product. Not surprising. If you have more people coming in, and immigrants don't come in to get welfare. That's part of the sort of Republican mantra. All these damn immigrants are coming in here and they're going on welfare. I don't think so. They come to work. And what happened in 2008 when the U.S. economy went down? Did Mexicans continue to come into the U.S.? No, because they knew there was a very low probability of getting a job. All right? Now it's starting to go back up again. All right? Immigrants, for the most part, are very highly motivated to come to work. So if they come to work, the more immigrants we have, the higher the rate of increase of our gross product. So essentially, immigration is going to turn us from negative to positive in terms of gross regional product. That's a very, very important finding. Now, this is where it becomes difficult. Now, are there any people from the media here, or did they go? No, that's okay. So I won't make bad comments about the media. But one thing that, I don't know whether your media are more sophisticated in Tijuana than they are in Chicago, but you cannot tell a complicated story. And a complicated story is one that has two parts. All right? And here you have two parts, because it matters where you look at the window, the time period, as to whether the effect is positive or negative. In the short run, gross regional product will decline. In the long run, gross regional product will increase. Why is that happening? This is that labor market effect that we noted. Immigrants, for the most part, are relatively low skilled. They're contributing to gross product, but the marginal rate is lower than the average rate. All right? Because we said their skill levels are lower than the existing population. So the impact on gross regional product per capita will decline. But the second generation from those immigrants, we hope, will be more skilled and therefore will contribute more GDP per capita than their parents, and so that over time the rate goes up. This is a very, very difficult story to tell the politician and to tell the newspapers, because they want one headline: immigration bad or immigration good. Not professor says it on the one hand, on the other hand. You know, they hate economists. They want a one-handed economist. All right. You know, it's this, it's negative, or it's positive. Okay. So, one of the interesting aspects of this analysis, the Gini coefficient increases. And that's because the immigrants tend to have lower incomes, and you have this downward push on wages, particularly among low skilled. So you do get this increase in the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income disparity. All right. And then we looked at the effects of migration at the upper end of the spectrum, retiree out-migration. And a lot of people in Chicago have said, why do we bother? Let the old guys leave. They're not productive. They may not be productive in the sense of contributing gross product, but they have enormous disposable income. Many of them have paid off their house. All right? All they have left is to spend money on their children, zero, or on themselves. All right? And they buy goods and services. They spend a lot of money on healthcare. Healthcare has the highest multiplier effect in the economy, in employment terms. And it also employs the most diverse set of skills, from the janitor all the way up to the brain surgeon. And so that's interesting. So one of the things that we found is that retiree out-migration, if we were to keep those people here, it would have a very positive impact, here being Chicago, on the economy because of the huge expenditures that they can potentially make. And during the recession from 2008 to 2012, retiree out-migration decreased because people could not sell their houses. And so they couldn't afford to move to Florida or to Arizona. And so they spent their money locally. And it really helped the economy weather the recession much more effectively than would have been the case had they all left. Did not have a very good effect on Arizona, Utah, and Florida, where the house prices declined more than any other part of the U.S. And why? Because there was not the energy coming from people from the Midwest and the Northeast of the U.S. coming to retire because they couldn't sell their houses. Finally, we're looking at the issue of human capital. We have a lot of things to say on this, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to blah, blah, blah on this. Here is the concern. The stylized fact would be as follows. An immigrant family comes from Korea. As happened in my building in Chicago, the parents opened a dry cleaning business to clean my jacket, right? They had 3 children. MBA, University of Chicago, law degree from University of Illinois, a bachelor's degree in business from University of Illinois. All 3 kids are professionals working, all right? An immigrant family comes from Central or South America, low skill. Maybe they open a lawn care business or a construction business to do renovations on houses. Their children inherit the business, all right? Because there isn't that sort of sense about the need to invest in education. And as a result, what we're seeing is among the ethnic groups increasing heterogeneity in terms of income levels. And particularly, and very much of a concern in the long run, what's going to happen particularly to the Latino population groups. And my fear is that 10 years ago in France, there were huge riots in Paris where the immigrant communities who had come from Tunisia and Algeria were in the suburbs, and their children had something like 60% unemployment rates. They just could not get jobs because they didn't have the skills. And so our Latino community, particularly the political leaders and the business leaders, are pushing very, very strongly with the Latino community. Because right now, they have the highest dropout rate from the high school, the lowest percentage of the youth population goes on to university. They have the lowest graduation rates from university. This is a very great source of concern. Absent some intervention, we may end up with 500,000 relatively low-skilled people in the Chicago region by 2030. So fortunately, our leaders are recognizing this problem now and not going to wait till 2027 to do something about it. So we have massive programs trying to encourage young people to stay in school, to go on to university, and so on and so forth. So it's really an interesting phenomenon, and our work was seen as very helpful in sort of highlighting those issues. So we were able to make a contribution to public policy. The other aspect of this is that if you have a more educated workforce, you have higher disposable income. And what we talked about was educational premium. In other words, if you get a baccalaureate, a bachelor degree, how much does this affect your lifetime earnings? And you can see what the number here is. In 1999 dollars, it was $600,000. In 2008 dollars, that's $750,000 more dollars over your lifetime. So if you divide this by 40, you've got about a $20,000 to $30,000 per year additional premium from having a bachelor degree, right? So the more educated people you have, the higher their salaries. The higher the salaries, the more they spend. The more they spend, the more jobs are created. So it's that classical multiplier effect that comes from increased income. And so we've been looking at this. And one of the interesting aspects of this is what would happen if we just had an additional 100 graduates a year from now until 2019, and then 1,000 a year more through 2040. And you can see what the percentage increase is over the reference. These are our forecasts for 2040 with no changes. And these are the incremental impacts. A 5% increase in population just by adding 1,000 more graduates. Why does that happen? It's because of the ripple effects that take place from this. And so investment in education is becoming one of the greatest aspects of this. So we're very concerned about it because if you look at the globalization of the economy right now, firms are choosing to locate in places with the human or occupational capital that they seek. They have huge choices. And places like Mexico are no longer the cheap labor force locations in the world. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, for example, are much cheaper than Mexico. So how is Mexico going to compete? And I think in this regard, the investment in human capital is going to be part of that process. And the next question then is, where should that investment be made? At the college level, or at the what we call the vocational technical level, where you're training the blue-collar workers, or at some other levels? But it's clearly part of the interesting debate that I think needs to go on, and it's certainly going on in the U.S. big time. And as one example of this, even though our manufacturing employment is declining, we have 313,000 vacancies in manufacturing in Illinois. That's a huge number. Why are they vacant? We don't have the skilled people. And part of the problem is nice suburban families don't want their kid to go into manufacturing. They want them to go into the financial sector. So we're going to have to change the way manufacturing is viewed. And as part of this process, University of Illinois is thinking about having a degree in manufacturing, but they're going to call it production engineering. All right? I don't know how much you're aware of advanced manufacturing using 3D printing and so forth. Requires enormous skills on the parts of operators. They need to have an undergraduate degree equivalent training to work in manufacturing. You don't need to be a giant to work in the steel plant anymore. You need to know how to use robotics. Go to an automobile assembly plant, you'll see the same thing. So this is a real source of opportunity that we need to embrace. And what we've done in subsequent research is try to look at providing incentives for individuals to invest in their education. Not once, but perhaps as many as 6 times during the course of their career in business. Why? Because technology is changing so rapidly, and what you learn when you're 22 may not be relevant when you're 42. And this is part of the attraction. So we're looking at this as part of an ongoing set of research. And for us, the attraction for interacting with you guys is it's so important for the health of our economy to understand what's going on in Mexico and vice versa. And I think that as we move forward, my dream is within the next 5 years, we can end up with models that will tell us what are likely to happen from changes that take place here, changes that take place within the U.S. and within Canada. Because I think if we can do that, we'll have a much better grasp on whether NAFTA can move from being just an organization focused on trade to something which is much more dynamic and globally sustainable and competitive. I just don't think we fully exploited it. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Hewings, for your excellent conference. We learned very much about not only economic models, also multiple views of processes. And now I give the microphone to Dr. Diaz-Bautista for start the discussion today.
Thank you. Good morning. And first of all, I would like to give a big welcome to Professor Hewings. here at Colegio de la Frontera Norte, COLEF, in Baja California, Mexico. And we're glad that he had a nice trip from Illinois to Baja. And Professor Hewings mentioned the need to train the next generation of economic analysts, and we're very interested. Professor Hewings has also given an excellent conference that is centered in the demographic changes in spatial development. And development economics has long recognized the important roles of demographic changes, and his research is based on the CGE econometric model, and it's a two-region CGE overlapping generations model. And during his presentation, Professor Hewings talked about the role of aging and the role of migration. And the study center in the Chicago metropolitan region. It shows the familiar social accounting system and the core of the CGE model. And some perspectives included in the study are the changes in the interregional trade and the in and out migration with aging, and also the demographic changes. Professor Hewings characterized the aging of the population as a demographic tsunami, and in order to analyze the demographic changes in the study, the AIDS model was presented, almost ideal demand system. So the study develops the CGE OLG model with the assumption of homotheticity of consumption preferences, and the final part of the analysis shows the rates of migration. As we have seen in the U.S., a great deal of attention has been directed to the economic structural changes affecting the state and regional economies. But as you mentioned, very little research has explored the role of demographic changes and their likely impacts over the next several decades. In particular, the issues of aging population and in migration, and those seeking employment opportunities in those regions. So we see the intersection between economic and demographic changes and interactions between the effects of aging, immigration, migration, and changes in the Social Security and the retirement age, which provide a complex mix of outcomes in the regional economies. Mexico is in the midst of an unprecedented demographic transition that is changing the size and age structure of the population. The most salient demographic change, and clearly the precursor of most other demographic changes, is the abrupt decline in the country's fertility rate. And it's one of the fastest declines in the world. This dramatic reduction of fertility rates has created a boom generation also in Mexico that is currently in its prime working years and that will gradually age and retire. As Mexico experiences sub-replacement fertility rates over the next decades, old age dependency ratios will escalate to unprecedented levels, carrying significant economic implications both to Mexico and the United States. Undoubtedly, the decline in the fertility rate is the most significant demographic change in Mexico and across most regions of the world, given that it is the key factor driving population growth. Over the next decades, Mexico will face sub-replacement fertility rates, patterns of childbearing that, holding on all other factors constant, will result in an indefinite population decline, which will lead to a gradual aging of the population. Estimates from the United Nations Population Division suggest that Mexico could face population declines as early as 2030. By then, the proportion of the elderly, defined as the cohort age 65 and above, will reach unprecedented levels, representing almost a quarter of the Mexican population. Countries such as Mexico that have reached a less advanced stage of demographic transition are afforded, by virtue of their younger populations, a unique but limited window of opportunity to implement economic policies directed to address the potential adverse effects of population aging on economic development. Over the next 20 years, Mexico will experience a growing workforce, defined as the 15 to 64 age cohort, which will bring about potential economic benefits through adjustments in the supply of labor, savings and investment decisions, education levels, and productivity, as explained by several studies. The consequences of Mexico's demographic transition extend well beyond its own economy, given the central role that Mexico is playing in the current U.S. immigration debate. A full understanding of the complex population dynamics south of the border is necessary for meaningful and valuable economic policy recommendations. Moreover, provided the importance of Mexico both as a market economy and as a production site, U.S. businesses should also benefit from a better understanding of the ongoing demographic changes in Mexico. Once again, we thank Professor Hewings for giving us an excellent presentation this morning at Colegio de la Frontera Norte College, and for inviting us to spend some time in Illinois. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you, Alejandro. Now the discussion is open. If you have questions or comments about the conference of Professor Hewings, please tell me and give us the name and what is the university where you're from. Please, Sarah.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was really thrilling for all of us. And I guess everyone's going to be a little shy because they have to speak in English. So, well, I encourage people to try to speak even in Spanish and someone can translate, but I think you can't miss this opportunity to interact with someone like Geoffrey who's visiting us today. And I'd like to get back to your presentation, but I guess much more in terms of what it means for us when we work in economics. And I think it's very refreshing because it gets us back to what theory is, what research is, and how we build aims for our research. Because I think that's kind of easy to lose. As economists, we can be very happy with our methodology, models, and everything. But I think it's not a two-part story, it's a three-part story. And I think that's the big, big thing you are bringing here today with all the students, because we have that theoretical work with all the things you explained about the model. Then we have the model working, but we have a third part, which is what it means in reality. And I think that's the hardest part to achieve, as you said, not only to talk with our people who are not academics, but even among academics, many, many times we just miss that little part of the way, which brings us back from data to what reality is and what it works, and how it works, sorry. So after saying that, I'd like to know if you have considered also different patterns in terms of different populations, not only in ages, but in consumption preferences too. Because you're telling us that almost a third of the population is from elsewhere. So I guess you also have that change, which is going to be very, very important in the next few years. And if you have any insights about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, please.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much, Alejandro. Let me just add a comment to your remark. One way that we have been considering addressing the shrinkage of the labor force is by having people spend longer in jobs. And people now say that 65 was considered a retirement when people were doing physical labor. And if you were in manufacturing, it was very tiring, or if you were down the coal mine and so forth. So perhaps that was appropriate. Now people are not physically working in that way, so perhaps 65 is no longer necessary. So we've seen two things happening. One is that in the US, we now have no limitation on retirement. And you're talking to somebody here who's very happy about that. And secondly, we've seen another interesting phenomenon where people have retired early and found that they don't have enough money because they're suddenly facing 20 or 30 years, and they're going back to work. And so we're trying to research this to find out, do they go back to the same jobs? If they've migrated to Florida, do they try to find a job there, or do they go back to Illinois or to New York? And if you go to a U.S. store like Walmart, they have that person in a blue shirt at the door with a happy face. It says, "Hello, have a nice day. Thank you for shopping at Walmart." That's probably a retired professor from the University of Illinois who could not get a job in his or her chosen field and is going into occupations like that. The McDonald's company has discovered that the elderly population are the most productive and the most stable. And they are increasingly hiring retirees to work in McDonald's. And here is the conundrum. A lot of businesses invest huge amounts of training in 20 to 30-year-old people. And on average, they spend 3 years with the company before they move on to somewhere else. If you train somebody in the 50s, there's a very high probability they will stay with you for 15 years. Now, if you provide that information to a firm and say, which is the best investment, they will still go for the 20-year-old because they think somehow old people don't get it, all right? And what they don't understand is that the rate of return on a retraining investment for somebody in the 50s is much higher, and the internal rate of return is higher than it would be on somebody in the 20s. So one way of dealing with this whole issue is dealing with this retraining problem. I think it was Secretary of State, Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich, when Clinton was president, who said that a person entering the labor force in the year 2000 can be expected to be trained or retrained 6 times. The University of Illinois, along with other higher education institutions, has no capacity to retrain people. I mean, we're very good at bachelor's, master's, and PhD, but not postgraduate, you know, the person who's 40 years old. How do we deal with that? So we need to think about how our institutions are going to respond, because clearly what you told me in Mexico with this declining fertility rate, at some point you're going to be facing the sort of problems we are right now. And if more and more of that younger generation migrate, then your problem is going to be increased, even though I think you said something by 2030, you're still going to be okay. So I think these are the reasons why I think linking our research agendas is so important, because what happens here has a profound impact on what happens in the US and vice versa. And that's why I think it's important. To Sarah's concerns, yeah, I mean, I think to my way of thinking, I don't understand economists who don't do that last part. I mean, yeah, it's fun to play around with asymmetric models of auction theory and have fun and so on and so forth. But then when somebody from the press calls you up and says, what's the implications? And you say, well, it all depends on the sign of the second derivative of the individual's utility function. You're very surprised that that correspondent never calls you back, because he has not the first idea what the hell you're talking about. All right? And I think that a lot of my economist colleagues don't like Krugman. He's a popularizer. He's a newspaper reporter. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being a fine interpreter of an economy? And I think that one of the my concerns when I teach regional economics is to say, what I hope at the end of this class you will learn is how economies work. And so much of what we teach in our schools is part here, part there, but nobody puts it all together. And what I try to do is explain to you how consumption interacts with migration, that interacts with investment in education, that interacts with investment in capital, and the implications of trade. In other words, I'm taking all the parts of economics and trying to build an understanding of our economy. And to my way of thinking, that's probably as great a contribution than thinking about specific policies. Not that I don't think we should avoid thinking about those things, but my feeling is unless you understand how the economy works, you can't enact policy. And a good example of this, when I talked to our governor who wanted to have policies to regenerate the economy, I said, Governor, if you were sick and you went to a doctor, a physical doctor, and the doctor didn't even look at you when you came in the room and wrote you a prescription and gave it to you and said, take that and call me in the morning. All right? The classic cliche. All right? What would you think of that doctor? And he said, I wouldn't go back to him. I said, why? Well, he didn't even look at me. I said, Governor, if you don't look at the state of Illinois and understand how the economy works, what the challenges are, how can you enact policy? Oh, we have to have policy. I agree with you, but you have to know which policy, all right? If you come in with a broken arm and the doctor gives you medication for your asthma, that's not going to help you with your broken arm, all right? The same thing is happening in the economy. And I think too many of our policymakers are, you know, they've learned, oh, there's a cluster-based development strategy. We have to have that. Why? What is the challenge in our state, all right? We have to diversify our economy, all right? We have to train more labor, but what type? In other words, you have to know your economy. And I think so many people don't do that. And I hope, and I hear from Noe's remarks over the last few years, that you're doing that here. So your students and hopefully your decision makers will understand this region's economy. Because I can tell you, so many times, that's not the case. So I'm sounding like the person at the Sunday church here, preaching to you. But I think it's so important. And if you don't understand your economy, nothing you can do is going to be of any value. So take the time to understand how it works. And you have wonderful models that can do this. And invest in understanding those, and I think you can make much greater contributions to economics.
Thank you. There are another question.
I don't have a question. I just want to let him that thank you for being here, Professor.
It's my pleasure. And thank you, Noe and Sarah, for being such wonderful hosts to me. And Alejandro, I didn't realize you had to travel so far to come here. I'm feeling very guilty and very humbled. You came farther than I did. So thank you so much.
Okay, nobody comment? Okay.
Well, it's just a comment. You assume that the migration would lower the wages of the...
Okay, close your mouth, please.
Would lower the wages of the lower skilled people. And there's a paper by David Clark that shows, well, that the majority of the people that right to Florida, he shows that that was not the case.
Right.
So just...
Yeah. What we're finding is it's very sector specific. and we certainly find this in construction, at least in the Chicago region, that the wages, if they haven't gone down in real terms, they have, but they just have not increased. They've lagged behind other sectors. But for example, in high-tech sectors, immigration has not had any impact. Wages have continued to increase. And the reason is that we still have a significant shortage there. So it is very, very sector specific. And it also depends whether wages are bargained locally or nationally. So if you, for example, immigrants work in the automobile industry, those wages are set nationally by union bargaining with the national automobile company. So whether it's an immigrant working or a non-immigrant has no impact. But in non-national bargain wage rates, we do see effect, at least locally in the Chicago region. Thank you.
Another question. I have a question. We need the regional indicators to understand the impacts of the waves, national or local waves, especially when they are broke. But I think when we are in the same country, it's more easy. But I mean, for example, border regions, like this region, where the immigration is important phenomena, and where there are many types of waves, two countries, different regions, many from many states from Mexico. Are you studying before specifically border regions around the world or in other parts of the US?
Yeah, I think this is unique geography here to have one of the most advanced countries right next to Mexico. And most of our theories always assume some sort of long-run equilibrium as a result of this without looking at some of the institutional constraints that are placed on this. And clearly, the whole development of the maquiladora was in response to the opportunities that private sectors saw in terms of moving literally across the river in some cases, that they could significantly lower their costs. That was further enhanced by the development of NAFTA that said if you had a content above 40%, then you were free of taxes. But I think in many cases the implications are so dynamic that we saw periods in the early part of this decade, this century rather, where there was massive declines in employment in the border regions in Mexico as firms relocated to Asia, where they could command even cheaper wage rates. So it's not, I think you can't look at this just as a two-country problem. You've got to take into account the rest of the world. And now we've got the problem that the word reshoring or onshoring is coming into the literature. And that is firms that have gone to China and now are coming back. The question is, are they coming back to the same locations? Are they coming back to Mexico? Or are they going somewhere else? But the Boston Consulting Group has estimated that within 3 years, Chinese wage rates will be the equivalent of those in Eastern Europe. And in 5 years to 6 years, they will be the same as Western Europe and the US. So then the question becomes, where does economic activity locate? And the question for Mexico is, will we be able to reclaim some of those jobs that were lost to China, or are we going to have to compete in some other different industries? And that's an issue that, again, I think would be a wonderful source of collaboration. But I think it's very important to think about what's happening in the rest of the world and not look at it just as UX Mexico, because firms are not. They are looking throughout the world for locations. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Another question. We need to go to professor to lunch break because it was hard the morning. We appreciate everybody staying here with us, and we
You are invited.
The next activity until 2 p.m. workshop. The first part, regional dynamic input-output model. will be here.
No, at Vero.
At the Ibero.
But you are
Universidad
invited
Iberoamericana.
to the conference tomorrow.
Okay, and we are invite you to stay with us and at the University Iberoamericana for the second part of conference and the workshop. Thank you for staying with us.